Claire never believed in ghosts. She never feared the dark, never flinched at old creaky buildings, and certainly never thought twice about the stories of places being haunted. But that changed the night she moved into apartment 4B at 312 Oak Ridge Lane. It started as a whisper, soft, distant, barely noticeable. At first she thought it was the wind slipping through old pipes or the hushed voices of neighbors beyond thin walls. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew clearer, closer, more desperate. And then, one night, they called her name. That was when she realized she wasn't living alone. The apartment building at 312 Oak Ridge Lane had been there since the 1920s, a towering monolith of brick and mortar looming over the street like an ancient sentinel. Over the years, it had fallen into a state of disrepair, with peeling paint, rusted pipes, and creaky wooden floors that groaned under the weight of time. The tenants were mostly transients, students, young professionals, and those who had nowhere else to go. Claire was one of them. New to the city, she had been thrilled to find an affordable one-bedroom on the 4th floor. But from the moment she stepped into the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The landlord had dismissed her unease with a chuckle. "Old buildings have character," he'd said. But Claire couldn't shake the sensation that the walls themselves were alive. On her first night, Claire woke to a faint whispering. Groggy, she sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She strained her ears, but the sound was faint, almost like a soft breeze slipping through cracks in the walls. Maybe it's the pipes, she thought, but as the minutes ticked by, the whispers grew louder, forming unintelligible phrases that seemed to dance along the edges of her comprehension. By the 3rd day, Claire had grown accustomed to the whispers. They began every evening around 10 p.m. and continued until just before dawn. Sometimes she thought she could make out words. "Help me, get out, stay away." She decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, Claire inspected the walls of her apartment. The wallpaper was old and brittle, curling at the edges. She pressed her ear against the wall in the living room and froze. The whispers were clearer now, not muffled by distance. They were frantic, pleading, and they weren't coming from the pipes. One night, as Claire lay awake, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. She followed the sound to the corner of her living room, where a large bookcase stood. The whispers seemed to emanate from behind it. Heart racing, she pushed the bookcase aside, revealing a narrow door she had never noticed before. The door was locked, but Claire found a rusty key hanging on a nail nearby. With trembling hands, she unlocked it. The door creaked open to reveal a dark, narrow passageway that smelled of mildew and rot. Claire stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls of the passage were lined with old, crumbling bricks, and the air was thick with a damp, earthy smell. As she moved deeper, the whispers grew louder, morphing into desperate cries. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with the flashlight, but when it came back on, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A series of small handprints smeared along the walls, as if made by someone trying to claw their way out. The passage led to a small, hidden room. The air was thick and oppressive, and the walls were covered in strange, childlike drawings, figures with hollow eyes, doors with jagged lines, and spirals that seemed to twist endlessly into darkness. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, its legs bolted to the floor. Shackles hung from its arms, and beneath it, the floor was stained dark with something Claire didn't want to identify. She felt a chill run down her spine as the whispers turned into anguished screams. They filled her head, reverberating off the walls and growing louder with each passing second. She stumbled backward, desperate to escape. As Claire turned to flee, the door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. The screams turned into guttural growls, and she could feel a presence behind her, a cold, malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. A raspy voice whispered in her ear, "You shouldn't have come here." Claire turned, her flashlight illuminating a shadowy figure with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It reached out toward her, and she screamed, dropping the flashlight. Claire bolted, her hands scraping against the jagged walls of the passage as she ran. The whispers chased her, growing louder and more chaotic. She burst back into her apartment, slamming the hidden door shut and shoving the bookcase back into place. But the voices didn't stop. That night, Claire packed her things and fled the building, vowing never to return. As she drove away, she glanced in her rearview mirror and saw the outline of the apartment building. For a brief moment, she thought she saw faces in the windows, watching her, waiting. A week later, a new tenant moved into Claire's old apartment. On their first night, they woke to the sound of whispers, faint and chilling, emanating from the walls. The apartment wasn't supposed to feel this way. When Claire first stepped into 312 Oak Ridge Lane, it had seemed like any other old building. Worn but sturdy, creaky but full of character. The landlord had smiled reassuringly as he handed her the keys, mentioning something about thin walls and noisy pipes. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. But the first night, the walls spoke. It wasn't the hum of the city outside. It wasn't the murmur of a neighbor's late-night TV. It was something else, something inside the walls. At first, it was just a whisper, so faint she almost convinced herself she was imagining it. But the whispers didn't stop. They returned every night, growing clearer, closer, more insistent. Words she couldn't quite understand at first. Pleading, warning, begging. And then, one night, in the deepest part of the dark, the whisper changed. It spoke her name. That was the moment Claire understood. She wasn't just hearing something. Something was listening too. Claire never went back to 312 Oak Ridge Lane. She left that night, stuffing clothes into a bag, heart pounding as the whispers grew louder. Furious, desperate, hungry. She didn't care about breaking the lease. She didn't care about the things she left behind. All she cared about was getting out before whatever was inside the walls finally got to her. As she drove away, she risked one last glance in the rearview mirror. The building loomed in the distance, its dark windows staring back like hollow eyes. And for the briefest moment, she saw movement, shadows shifting behind the glass, as if watching her go. A week later, a new tenant moved into apartment 4B. On their first night, they woke to a faint whisper. It slipped through the silence like a breath against their ear, soft but unmistakable. "Help me. Get out." And then finally, a name. Not Claire's. Theirs.